So, Khadijah, thank you for coming back to BAME Online. It's really, really nice to see you.
Thank you for having me. I'm always excited to be in this space and to help, I guess, people think more provocatively about things that I think we sometimes maybe don't understand enough or take for granted, things that exist in our sort of like public lexicon and our everyday sort of political analysis, because every single one of us engages in an everyday political analysis. Things that have become really like big subjects for organizations, for institutions. But in that, there's a lot missing. There's a lot of history missing. There's a lot of criticality missing. There's a lot of analysis missing as well. And I'm hoping that today, through this sort of conversation, we can get to the sort of nitty gritty and leave this space with a little bit more of a critical perspective of how we think about the word privilege, or how we think about what presents itself as an analysis of privilege.
Yeah. And I think everybody in this room must be feeling a little bit uncomfortable because we've all got a bit too comfortable with using the word privilege and just kind of like flashing it about. And I don't think many of us have kind of thought too much about, what we're talking about when we say privilege at all. For everybody who does not follow Khadijah on Twitter, sorry, I've been like putting this tweet absolutely everywhere. Must be a little bit disconcerting for you. But it says, daily reminder that privilege politics is limited, often reductive, and offers a depth of analysis that it can seldom actually realize, especially when privilege is indiscriminately applied to bodies as an essentialism without context. You've managed to say quite a lot there.
A lot of things in there. Really
a lot. You should be.
Stuff.
I am concise. And we've managed to create a whole event based off just this tweet. We're probably not going to stray too far from the words that are in this. But it really struck me. And I think, I've moved away from talking about so many concepts. I don't think I'm a massive fan of privilege, but I definitely find it just slipping into conversation because it's kind of easy to use and it's something that everybody understands, right? So tell us, what is it that inspired this tweet? Where did this come from?
So I chose this image, and I think it's a really important image. I kind of just typed into Google image search like navel gazing, and this came up and it was fantastic. And essentially, like, this is for me what grounds how we should think about privilege politics, right? It's emerged as this immersive and massive tool for understanding power, but that's kind of not what it is, and it's kind of not what it ever was. And I think it's important when we do these sort of things, when we think about these political statements, these political positions, these political analyses, that we think about their history, think about where they came from. So privilege politics actually finds, and that analysis of privilege that we use in these kind of everyday interactional ways, finds itself in the very white feminist politics that existed kind of pre sort of the dawn of kind of entrenched racial politics and racial analysis. But when we say like white privilege specifically, I think it's really important to think about the genealogy of white privilege. So does anyone know this lady? I don't think so, right? This isn't a face that is familiar to many people, but she actually coined white privilege. She genuinely coined white privilege in a paper in 1989, which was a reflexive paper. So it wasn't an academic article. It wasn't a research paper. It wasn't a journal paper. It was an essay of self-reflection. And in this essay of self-reflection entitled Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, this is, Peggy McIntosh, who this woman is, essentially goes through this process and creates this list. She sits with herself and decides to make a list of things that she as a white woman can do that Black people can't do. And that's how we get privilege politics. It's an interactional, it's a reflexive process. But we've somehow come to understand privilege politics as this massive and immersive and, poignantly useful analytical tool for understanding the entirety of racial politics. And that troubles me. And it troubles me because prior to McIntosh's articulation of this introspective list of things that she could do that Black people can't do, which is so problematic if you think about it. There was good scholarship that articulated the complexity of whiteness that was missed. So an analysis of whiteness that I think we think privilege politics offers us, that it doesn't, is an analysis that comes from a fantastic scholar called W.E.B. Du Bois. So Du Bois has an analysis of whiteness in his work on the sort of organization and reconstitution of American society that understands whiteness as property, understands that through the creation of the American empire, through the sort of creation of a racially subjective politics or a racial subjugation, there was a need to create and coalesce a form of whiteness that working class white people could buy into. Britain has a similar project. The project of British nationalism comes through this similar need to have working class people buy into a project, view themselves as having a property or a stake in a particular category, this category being whiteness. And I'll even stretch my analysis of Britishness, right? The project of Europeanism is not a geographic project. I was having to explain to someone that, Europe isn't actually technically a continent. Europe is a geopolitical project. It's a geopolitical project of whiteness, of homogenizing, of coalescing, and of basically re-articulating a white supremacist power by having people buy into something, having people have a stake in something. People who traditionally have nothing in common, because it's important to recognize that on a material level, on a realistic level, white working class people have no similarities to white bourgeois class people, right? So whiteness gave them that something to buy into. Whiteness gave them that something to fight for. Whiteness gave them no actual property, no actual wealth, no actual reprise from the subjugation of white bourgeois, upper class, monarchical people. But it gave them this kind of immaterial, this skin color project that allowed them to feel a sense of that supremacy, which when we think about it, really, they didn't have, right? But they were allowed to buy into the property of whiteness, and the property of whiteness offers to them something. So for me, to have an analysis of whiteness as simply an interactional privilege, simply something I can sit there and look at and navel gaze and, reflect on and think about all the things that I can do that white people can't do, that white Black people can't do. I think it's not in depth, right? It's not deep. It's not material. It's not meaningful in any of the significance that we tend to put on it today. It's meaningful so insofar as white people, absolutely should reflect on how they're organized within society, how they have this sort of property of whiteness. But thinking of it as anything beyond that becomes wholly useless.
So I guess there's no kind of situating that in like why and where did you end up with these privileges, right? There's actually no kind of like historical analysis whatsoever. It's just like it kind of happened.
Exactly.
And we're completely like divorcing ourselves from like why it happened and what purpose it serves.
Right. And I think the thing that I find the most challenging about this articulation of privilege politics is that it becomes meaningless because it doesn't have the depth. Right? It becomes meaningless because it doesn't have the history. It becomes meaningless because it doesn't actually offer us a more useful, more critical literacy of what race is. It assumes that race, by virtue of its, application on a body, simply just presents privilege. That's not good analysis. And I don't actually think that was the intention of McIntosh. When you read her essay, McIntosh makes the claim and actually cites people like Combahee River Collective, I think poorly, and I think misunderstands their project, to articulate whiteness as a form of power. But white privilege isn't that analysis. White privilege is an introspective analysis, a reflexive analysis of an individual's relation to society. I think what, McIntosh articulates could also very much be re-articulated on the basis of her, gender and on the basis of her class. And I think privilege politics, although as sort of McIntosh was articulating it, did not maybe mean to become this individualist politics of you need to check this privilege and you need to check this privilege. It's become that because that's the current moment in which we're in.
Mm-hmm. People who might actually have come onto this call and think, wow, race is about skin color. I'm white, therefore, like I have this experience, or like I am Black and like it's somehow kind of intrinsic to human nature. Can you explain to people like why that is nonsense, poppycock?
In the most simple answer, it's poppycock because it's race science, right? That being said, there is a social organization of our society that depends on the logics of race. So race not simply as whiteness, but race as a means of categorizing, positioning, and organizing society, right? That's still substantial. And in the first instance, the way it's articulated, the way it's understood is absolutely about skin color. But the point isn't that we should defend, we should, re-articulate and, stick our foot in the sand and constantly repeat this idea. The point is that we should develop our analysis and understand that race as a technology is a dehumanizing technology. It's a mystifying technology. So what I mean by that is that there is an eligibility of race. So blackness means something because of what whiteness created blackness to mean. But as we understand, right, blackness is not homogenous. Blackness is, in a sense, an experience, a political experience organized around the logics of race as a technology. And I would go so far as saying racial capitalism as a technology, right? And I think when we do the work of simplifying race as just an interaction between individuals with individual skin colors, what we do is we re-articulate that racist or racial essentialist position that, blackness is ontologically, I know that's a big word.
Yeah.
Fixed onto particular bodies, and whiteness is fixed onto particular bodies. But race is so much more complex than that, right? Race is an articulation of empire. Race is an articulation of nationhood. Race is a technology of nationhood, a technology of, monarchy, a technology of power. That in the first instance was presented to us through these sort of race essentialist, race scientific ideas of phrenology and morphology.
But part of that simplification is racism in action, isn't it? Like us kind of simplifying it to these neat little boxes that we can stick people into. And even, people who are trying to dismantle racism do exactly the same thing.
Exactly. Right? And
I don't ever going to be free,
answers, right? Because I think in the current moment, that is still such a potent ability for us to understand society. It's still powerful. It's still impactful. It still means things for our lives. It means something for me to be a Black person. It means something for someone else to be a white person. It means something for someone else to be an Asian person, et cetera, et cetera. It means something through the history of how we've understood race and empire and through how we understand nationhood. But interactionally, putting that essentialist weight on it, it misses things. It misses the power, it misses the history, it misses the project of nationhood and empire, and creates this sort of culture of individualism and individualistic blame. And that individualistic blame has a problematic history, right? And even in how it's articulated today, it's why people can say things such as like meritocracy is the bedrock of British society, and your failure as a Black person is a personal failure.
That's kind of part of the function of neoliberalism, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Is to re-articulate this individualism, but the individualism also is problematized through race because it fixes race. It says that, well, the data tells us that lots of Black people underachieve, so it's a Black problem. It's not a Black problem, it's a societal problem. Right. And I don't even think it's just a problem of whiteness. It's a global problem. It's a global problem that has a history, that has a genealogy, and that has and that has a legacy, essentially. Like privilege politics, people don't know what intersectionality is. And oftentimes you find these things are used interchangeably. Right. People think the intersectional position is an analysis of privilege that acknowledges lots of different privileges. That's not what intersectionality is. Like, that's not what it is. Intersectionality is an analysis of intra-group differences organized through an understanding of the intersection of race, class, and gender. In its inception, Crenshaw was basically looking at how within kind of the judicial framework, we had a category that understood womanhood or gender, often taxonomically bound to like white women's experiences of gender. And we had an analysis of race, again, often understood in terms of Black male experiences of racialization. But what was missing was an articulation within the legal framework of where these things meet. So there was basically a crisis in the judicial system that basically ignored what was the complexity of the Black woman or Black women's experiences, or the complexity of that intersection between gender and race as a sort of like organization within the judicial framework. Somehow, this critique of the state, of the judicial state, this critique of categorization and of data and of empirical data bound up with the prison system and with the American judicial system becomes used as an identity in the first instance, which is really problematic, as people say, I'm intersectional, or like I'm an intersectional feminist, whatever that means. And it also becomes a rearticulation of privilege politics, but a privilege politics that views itself as additive. So it becomes check your privilege insofar as you're adding privileges that you have. Like if you're male plus white plus, rich, plus this, plus that, minus this, it becomes an additive politics. And the point that Crenshaw has continuously made, as much as he's misunderstood, is that intersectionality is not additive. It's an analysis of intra-group difference, right? It's an analysis of within a category, the complexities within that category due to the intersection of these kind of characteristics of these categories. But privilege politics forces us to engage in the understanding of intersectionality as additive. Right? It tells us that you have this privilege plus this privilege plus this privilege. Or on the flip side, you have this oppression plus this oppression plus this oppression. That's not what the analysis of intersectionality is offering. So whereas privilege politics makes us think of race plus class plus gender plus sexuality, an intersectional analysis should be offering us race is class, is gender, is sexuality within these sort of articulations of these intergroup categories.
All of these words are kind of being imported and then just kind of used as buzzwords in order to not actually engage in what needs to be engaged with. You can just hold up intersectional, bam, that stops people from critiquing you. Bam, check my privilege. Like I'm an ally. You can't critique me. Wow. It's like, it's so interesting. It's like, where are we learning these words from? Like, actually, like, why are we so lazy that we wouldn't do any further research? And actually, is there even a way for us to get past the nonsense if you don't have like someone like you to talk to? How are people actually going to get to, firstly, like, the history of these words, like understanding that like just saying words for word's sake is not going to dismantle white supremacy.
Right? Instead of ending the production of whiteness, we're forcing people just to acknowledge their whiteness. And a lot of people can't acknowledge their whiteness because they don't even know what whiteness means, right? We don't know what whiteness means. And I think whiteness moves beyond the project of morphology. Whiteness is no longer about white skin. Whiteness has not been about white skin ever. It's about a project of reorganizing society. It's about a project of producing something in society. And through that production, there was a need to placate people. And that placation of sort of like the masses of white people who had nothing in common with their oppressors was offering them property in a project. And that project makes them just a little bit less precarious. So they buy into it.
Yeah.
But they're still precarious. But race is a mystification. It's a tool of mystification, right? It's a tool of solidarity breaking.
Yeah.
It's a tool of coalition breaking. And we see it constantly repeated and rearticulated in the current moment.
Actually, the levels that people are willing to go to talk about privilege politics is because it's comfortable, it's easy, like,
It's so easy and it requires no actual change. We tend to find that, like, white people acknowledging their privilege, it sounds like a humble brag. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm a white woman settler. My parents were colonizers. Like, what are you doing? What are you actually doing? Acknowledgement
it's just deflecting, isn't it? Because that's like for a lot of people, that's enough. It's like, wow, we're going to hold you up as anti-racist heroes, your allies.
In this moment, that's what's become enough. I don't care how able white people are able to sit and self-flagellate. What I care about is what they do, right? What I care about is what they do. What I care about is white people who literally, like, at any given point, commit what is basically like I'm trying to find the useful language of this, a sabotaging of that whiteness, or a denial of that property of whiteness. White people who reject that property, and they reject that property because they understand that that property is meaningless. It's a symbolic property that, beyond what it can offer them in the sort of like interactional, exist as a mystification. They understand themselves as like, the average white person has nothing in common with Boris Johnson and the political elite. Has nothing
definitely.
in common with, you know, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and co. They have nothing in common, but whiteness gives them the idea that they have things in common, and they don't. Nothing materially, nothing meaningfully. There's a point I wanted to make with this this PowerPoint, and it links to another point, and it's probably the most salient point that I'm going to make in this space. And it's something that has concerned me, something that concerns me, something that deeply, deeply troubles me, right? So beyond privilege politics being this self-flagellation by white people, what it's now become is accusation for Black and brown people. Privilege discourse as an interpersonal discourse. If we say privilege is simply this addition of different things that we experience or don't experience, we can all be accused of having privileges in instances in which we don't. Articulating and understanding interactional differences of power is important, right? So you, Martha, you and I have differences, right? We have experiences that are different. Those experiences oftentimes are articulated as one more oppression or one less oppression. That's not helpful, because what that does is it accuses, in this example, you of having privilege over me in an interaction, whereas actually our accusation should be towards the state. And to give you an example, I was in a space lately, in a room, I was talking, and someone came in and looked at the speakers and was like, well, you guys are privileged. And I'm like, yeah, we might be, but you're assessing our privilege on the basis of an assumption you're making about people who are relatively faceless and nameless to you, people whose lives you know nothing about, and then presenting yourself in that instance, without knowing the complexity of our experiences, as being the oppressors of you, right? In that space, a Black person, a working class person, can get charged as being privileged beyond an analysis of structural power. And what's really like damaging about it is it essentializes us and fixes us as irredeemable or harmful on the basis of particular characteristics that we have. That's dehumanization. That's carcerality. That's saying, because how your body is presenting to me, I know everything about you. And as such, I can make claims about your behavior, your intentions, and how you move through the world. And for me, privilege politics, because of its hyper focus on these interactions, on these individualisms, on these interpersonals, it doesn't offer us an ability to coalesce, to see our coalition as something that is possible, to see beyond the fixtures and see beyond the dupes that are offered to us by oppressive society, and to see past our oppression as not something that fixes us, as something that we can liberate ourselves from. I don't want the white people I'm in coalition with and I'm in solidarity with to acknowledge their whiteness. I don't care about that. What I want them is to understand their whiteness as property and to give it up, and to say to me, or to, in their action, prove to me that they understand how our current society organizes them and benefits them. It doesn't even though, right? It really doesn't. Because again, we know that like wealth is everything. Know that this property, this fictitious property that the upper class elites through their historical creation of race offered them, they have no stake in that property. They don't want that property. So they're willing to engage with us in this emancipatory project, in this transformation of society for the benefit of all of us. That they don't want this conditional, this symbolic political gesture. They want their needs met just as much as we do. And that's why we're fighting. That's why we're organizing. That's why we're making the demands that we're making. They understand that anyone can be replaced in the system of hegemony. And as such, we need to completely reorganize society into one that does not allow for that hegemony to exist. We're both dismantling whilst existing within, whilst imagining different, because we're running away from, right? And like the fugitive doesn't know where he's going. He just knows that he needs to get out of there. So does what he can to get out of there. And it's an imperfect analysis, and it's imperfect work. All the work that we're doing is imperfect, but we're fugitives, right? We're just running. And right now we have to run and dismantle. And that's kind of the place of solace. That's the place we can hold ourselves and hold each other. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. And again, guys, I don't have even close to an iota of the answers to the provocations and critiques that I've offered in this space. I'm just trying to figure it out. And I just hope that we figure it out together, I guess.